The RFNG is supported in part by the funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Self-determination, self-governance, inherent right to self-government, reconciliation, Section 35. These are terms we use quite a bit when we're talking about our Rebuilding First Nations governance research. But what do they actually mean?
I guess when I think about self-determination, it's about responsibility. And I feel like our work builds individual self-determination. And we have to be firm about the fact that we're as willing to accommodate them as we expect them to accommodate us.
Self-government means to me is we have the right to put back in place our own government. One of the key things is that Section 35 doesn't give you anything. It can't define anything for you because that's our job. We have the right to put back in place our own laws necessary to not only govern our people, but to govern our territories, and also to have that new relationship with Canada.
Hello, and welcome to the Inherent Rights Informed Voices, a podcast brought to you by the Center for First Nations Governance and a Rebuilding First Nations Governance project. Today, we're delving into the key concepts of Indigenous governance. What does it mean for First Nations to be self-determining, and how does that shape reconciliation in Canada? Satsan Herb George and Chris Robertson will be exploring these ideas further by placing into context their years of work advocating for inherent rights and the Canadian government's duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples. My name is Dr. Mason Ducharme, and I will be your host for today. Emishkate and Sheshketcha, Biwadulkan, Shamakwamkan, Statlimkan. Good day, everyone. My traditional name is Ketchia. I'm from the Liwat Nation, Shamakwam Nation, and both are part of the Statliam Nation. I've been working with the RFNG project since 2021, and I'm now working as a National Community Research Director. I am also CFNG's Executive Director. After successfully defending my dissertation last year on Indigenous executive turnover, this experience reinforces my dedication to seeing First Nations flourish. Here to begin the plot of our inherent rights story is Dr. Satsan Herb George. He's one of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs of the Frog Clan. He's been a visionary in inherent rights work for over 40 years and is a founder of the Center for First Nations Governance and a co-director for the Rebuilding First Nations Governance project with Dr. Francis Abel. But more than that, Satsan is my longtime mentor and friend. Hi Satsan, thanks for joining us on our podcast today.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
So Satsan, we're hoping to provide our listeners with some general definitions of some of the key terminology we use in our work. So some of the terms we're looking at are self-determination. What does self-determination mean to you, Satsan?
Well, there are several different meanings, of course, but I think one of the ones that listeners should think about is going to UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and looking at what it says in there because it's world in scope, I guess. The right of self-determination is the right to political status, legal status, the right to have an economy, the right to, have our own social structures and our cultural practices. And when you look at all of that and when you start to exercise all of that, of course, you're You're exercising your right of self-government, and the right to finance your own government. And your right, most important right in terms of all of that, is your right to nationality or citizenship. And then you look at, what we've accomplished in terms of recognition and the law and the Constitution. We've also got the recognition of the right to self-determination there. The right of self-government, the inherent right to self-government, all recognized in law and in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. And embedded in all of that is the legal and constitutional procedure to drive negotiations towards realizing the right of self-determination and the right of self-government, including our inherent right to self-government. So if you look at it like, those things, and you look at the 5 pillars of the inherent right to self-government that we use as a frame of reference when we're working with our people in our communities and in our nations, we talk about the 5 pillars. Number 1, relating to the land. So we have the right to self-determination and the right to self-government over our entire territories, to be able to fulfill our obligations and our responsibilities, and to be able to use it as we've done for countless generations before. And you look at the 2nd pillar, the people, the right to determine our own citizenship. And when we go in and work amongst our people, our elders are very, very clear on this point. They're saying the most important thing here is to be able to identify who you are as a person of that nation, and to be able to identify who we are collectively, who make up the nation. So those are 2 very important points. And when you look at the 3rd pillar that we use, which is jurisdiction and laws, we have the right to put back in place our own laws necessary to not only govern our people, but to govern our territories, and also to have that new relationship with Canada, nation to nation to nation, government to government to government, whatever you want to call that. And we have the right to our own governance systems, as well as resources, the right to be a people, in order to exercise that right of, self-determination and self-government, and also the right to use our territories to have an economy. And so that 3rd part, the 5 pillars that I talk about, is in the realm of the Aboriginal perspective. That's our perspective of what self-determination means and what self-government means. So those are 3 different perspectives, but I think they all match and they connect, and it's important for people to understand all of it. But that there is one important thing about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that it's not legally enforceable unless a nation state makes it a part of its law. And in Canada has put forward legislation recognizing UNDRIP, and so has British Columbia. So recently there was a case coming out of the Supreme Court on Bill C-92, which is the children and family legislation. And the Supreme Court says it directly that on its own, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is not legally enforceable unless a nation state makes it a part of its law, which Canada has done. So, UNDRIP applies, it is legally enforceable in Canada, but the question that still remains is, to what extent has it recognized? How much of it is there? So that has to be determined yet. But that's a long answer to a really important question.
I really appreciate that. And when you were talking, there were some other terminology that we're hoping to get defined too. So you mentioned this term self-governance. What does self-governance mean?
Well, we've been fighting since before Confederation and since Confederation in 1867 with the inclusion of Section 9124, the Indian Act, where federal jurisdiction takes full authoritative jurisdictional control over us as Indians and lands reserved for Indians, and forced us off of our territories and onto reserves, number one. But most importantly, secondly, and this is what a lot of the Canadian public don't understand or just are ignorant about, is it also served to separate us out from the rest of the Constitution. So, you look at this whole notion of, public policy. We've never been a part of that public policy dialogue because we've been separated out. And so since that time, we've been fighting for a recognition in my context in British Columbia of a recognition of Aboriginal title and the rights associated with it, including the inherent right to self-government. And the big part of that fight was to gain this recognition so that we can put back in place our own government under our own law to be able to not only govern our people in our territories, but to have that new government to government relationship with Canada, which we should have had at the outset. So we've accomplished that. So what self-government means to me is we have the right to put back in place our own government. And for myself as a Wet'suwet'en person, the Wet'suwet'en Nation, we were the ones who took the court case forward that gained that first recognition, along with the Gitxsan Nation. And so the case was brought forward by our hereditary chiefs on behalf of our people. And they represented our government, which was a clan-based government, which was exercised in what we call the potlatch. It was totally transparent and accountable. Everybody was a part of it. So in our work doing, trying to put back in place our own right of self-government, there are some nations where that memory is very, very strong of what kind of government that they had. And that's what the people want to put back in place. And in other places, that memory is distant and dim. So all there is maybe is the foundation that they can see and remember. And they don't remember the system that they had, let alone how it worked structurally, what it looked like, and so on. But nevertheless, they still have the right to put back in place a modern or a new form of government that works for them. So that's the scope of it, that for the Wet'suwet'en people, our traditional form of government is strong. It's there. We still exercise it. We still use it. In other places, it's not. But the constant is you can have your own traditional form of government, or you can put in place a new form of government. So it's the right to have a government to govern our people and our territories, and to have that new government to government relationship with Canada, which is a right that we've won recognition of under Section 35 of the Constitution Act.
I feel like what you're dropping are really amazing gold nuggets. The things I get questioned a lot by from my family and friends is, what is the inherent right to self-government?
It's probably the most important thing that we've gained recognition of. Because if you go back and you look at the fight for recognition, we tried every which way. We tried legally, politically, internationally. We tried negotiations. We tried direct action on the land and so on. And ultimately, we're forced into the court. The whole bottom line fight was, first of all, for recognition of Aboriginal title and rights, including the right to self-government, and also on the treaty side, the recognition of treaty rights, including the right of self-government. And, in the fight for this recognition, of course, Canada repatriated the Constitution in 1982. And our leadership, First Nations leadership across this country, realizing what was happening, got together and got organized and said that we better work to be a part of this. And that's how Section 35 came about. And so Section 35(1) says that recognized and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of our people across the country. And then, of course, with Delgamuukw and Gistewe, the court case that our people brought, we won that first legal and constitutional recognition. And if you look back on the repatriation, when that Constitution was put in place in 1982 with the inclusion of Section 35, there was a promise of constitutional conferences between our leadership across the country and the first ministers across the country. So there were a series of constitutional conferences, and you can look on National Film Board and you can see a couple of documentaries about that called Dancing Around the Table. What our leadership was trying to accomplish in those series of constitutional conferences was to further define Section 35. And what they wanted to have included under Section 35 was the inherent right to self-government. They weren't successful through those constitutional conferences. However, we were successful in terms of the courts. We won that recognition legally and constitutionally. So, Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act 1982 now includes the recognition of the inherent right to self-government. Now, why is that so important? Why it's important was because in Delgamuukw and Gistewe, for example, our first argument going into the Supreme Court of British Columbia, was that our title and rights comes first of all from our own law. In other words, it's pre-existing. It's inherent. We always had it. And at the BC Supreme Court, Chief Justice MacQuarrie's decision, he said that there's no way we could have had laws because we weren't sufficiently civilized as a people. And he said that at best our lives were nasty, brutish, and short, quoting Hobbes from Leviathan. And then interestingly, he misspells Hobbes. But by the time we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada, we had won that recognition that yes, Aboriginal title, first of all, comes from our own law. And that's what's important about that, is that it's inherent, that we always had it. And of course, when we won the recognition of the inherent right to self-government under Section 35, what that means is we've always had this right. It's inherent. We had it before we entered into Confederation. It survived Confederation. It's not the subject of a grant from anybody because we always had it. And it's now recognized and affirmed under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. And then further to that, with the Haida case, the Supreme Court of Canada finally just came out and they just said it. The reconciliation that we're talking about under Section 35, the promise of reconciliation, is the reconciliation between the pre-existent sovereignty of First Nations and the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. That's the importance of it. When we talk about the recognition of our pre-existent sovereignty, when you look into the fact of our history, we've exercised that right of self-government over our people in our homelands, our territories, our sacred homelands, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So what we've effectively accomplished by gaining this recognition of the inherent right to self-government is to gain recognition of our pre-existent sovereignty. So if you look at the Constitution Act now, you look at Section 91, which is the federal jurisdiction. It lays out all the federal government's powers, including the Indian Act. And you look at Section 92, it lays out all of the provincial government's powers, including over children and family, which is important to us. And you look over to Section 35 now. What the inherent right to self-government means there is that it doesn't come from Section 35, and it doesn't come from the common law. All the common law does, and what Section 35 does, is to recognize our pre-existent sovereignty. So we come into the Constitution under Section 35 with that pre-existent sovereignty, right? And the legal and constitutional procedure that's there to drive negotiations towards reconciliation, government to government to government, is jurisdictional. That means we come under Section 35 with our own government, under our own jurisdiction, with our own laws. And the legal and constitutional procedure that's there is that reconciliation is between our law and their law, and the Crown's law. So that's the critical importance of the inherent right to self-government. And it's very, very important to our elders, because it really bothered them when they at first assumed that the inherent right to self-government that we have comes from the common law and the Constitution. So being able to explain it to them and to say, no, it doesn't. All we did was to use the Constitution and the law to recognize what we know we always had and still have, which is pre-existent sovereignty. And that's what the inherent right to self-government means. It's very, very powerful. The key to it is that unless and until we as First Nations across this country move out of the Indian Act, Section 9124, under federal legislation, as long as we stay there, we don't have any jurisdiction. We don't have any authority. So unless and until we move from Section 9124 to Section 35, there is no jurisdiction to reconcile. And that's really, really important. When I was talking about the right of self-determination, coming from UNDRIP, coming out of the law and the Constitution, but there's also the Aboriginal perspective. And this is very, very important in all of this. because throughout these different court cases and defining Section 35 of the Constitution Act, one of the important things was to get that recognition of our pre-existing sovereignty under our own law. So what came out of the court in Chilcotin was that when it comes to Aboriginal title and treaty rights now under Section 35, that is no longer just the common law that's at play here now. There's also the Aboriginal perspective, which includes our law. And that's very, very important because, like looking at Section 35 and the notion of that you have to move out of Section 9124 to Section 35 in order to exercise it. That's really, really important because it comes from the Aboriginal perspective. If you're looking at it strictly from the common law, then you will miss that. And what's important there is, why did we go to court? Why did we put in place a constitutional argument? What did we want to do with that? Why, right? So there's a couple of reasons. The first one is we had to create jurisdictional space in Canada's Constitution for our inherent right to self-government, for our jurisdiction, and for our law. So we accomplished that. So what's important about the Aboriginal perspective is that it's no longer now just the common law, it's also our law. And so that's why when I'm talking about the right of self-determination, the third part of it, after looking at UNDRIP and the law and the Constitution, what is our perspective on it? And that perspective is of utmost important because the Supreme Court said that it's no longer just the common law now. Now it's also the Aboriginal perspective, and they are equally weighted. That's really, really critical.
I think one of the things that's most powerful with what you do, Satsan, is you really help communities reawaken their Aboriginal perspective with the workshops that we bring to CFNG when we get them to reflect on the 5 pillars, right? We say we don't know what your Aboriginal perspective is. You guys are the expert. We're going to be asking you the questions to reawaken them.
It's so important using those 5 pillars as a frame of reference because you're doing so many things with it. You're accomplishing so much with it, right? So if you look at Section 35 and the recognition that we've achieved there, one of the key things is that Section 35 doesn't give you anything. It can't define anything for you because that's our job. We have to define what our right is under Section 35. So if you look at the use of those 5 pillars, the people, the land, jurisdiction and laws, governance systems, and resource, both the human resource capacity necessary to govern our people in our lands, to have an economy as well. So you look at all of that, and when you start to define all of that, just first of all, to define your right under Section 35, it also fills up that box that I look at it, and in terms, you're also defining your Aboriginal, your perspective, your Aboriginal perspective, in its fullest form. So there's 2 very, very compelling reasons about why that's so important.
How did First Nations achieve recognition of their inherent rights over the past decades, including through Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982? And what were the key moments along that journey?
It's been a fight for our people right across this land that we now know as Canada since before Confederation and since Confederation. Our leadership referred to that as unfinished business. And we tried to negotiate, we tried the international arena, looking at the international court and realizing, well, you can't get to the international court until you've exhausted all domestic remedies, And we weren't successful in negotiations because the Crown always insisted that, well, we'll negotiate with you, and you have to, in return, extinguish whatever rights you think you have in the land and as a people. So on the one hand, they were saying, we want you to extinguish your right, and on the other hand, they're saying you don't have it. And so ultimately, we're forced into the courts. So there's a few big important moments, one in history, right? One was the inclusion of Section 35 in the Constitution Act. And I look back at our leadership of the time and, the courage and discipline and vision that they had. Thank goodness they were able to get organized to that point to launch an international campaign, lobbying campaign, sufficient to the point where the House of Lords in England were saying to Canada, because of our leadership's lobby, that if you don't include Section 35 in the Constitution Act, we're not going to agree to repatriation. That's amazing. That is just unbelievable that they were organized to that degree that the House of Lords would stand up and say that. So Canada was pretty much forced into a position where, okay, if we don't recognize Section 35, then we're going to fail at repatriation of the Constitution Act. So they were forced in a way to add Section 35. And of course, what happened then was, from our leadership's perspective, they weren't able to get all of the language that they were looking for, which was the inclusion of the inherent right to self-government. And so when the Constitution was repatriated in 1982, Section 35 was added, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal title and treaty rights. And so that was a big, big moment. However, at that time, Section 35 was recognized and characterized as an empty box of rights. So when Canada was negotiating with our leadership, if you look at and read Section 35, it says the existing Aboriginal and treaty right. That word existing is important. And it was Premier Lougheed, I believe, from Alberta, who insisted on the inclusion of that word. And the reason why that was so important to the Crown was their definition of existing was that there weren't any more existing Aboriginal or treaty rights because they had all been extinguished as a result of Confederation. So it was viewed as an empty box of rights. And so, of course, the second thing that's important is when we realize that there's no other way to do this but by going into the courts. And that was a very, very difficult decision because, in effect, we're going into a foreign court and we're using a foreign law. And we went into the court and we changed the law. We changed the Constitution and we defined it. So the few defining moments, the first one was on Delgamuukw and Gisteway when we achieved the first definition of Section 35 to include the recognition of Aboriginal title and rights and the protection of that. And then subsequently to that, through a succession of other cases, to gain the recognition of the inherent right to self-government under Section 35 as well. So those were the key defining moments. One was the inclusion of Section 35, and the second was to define it so that you have the clear recognition. And the biggest one was that recognition of our pre-existent sovereignty, so that it's clear that the inherent right to self-government that we're talking about here, that is now recognized and affirmed under Section 35, doesn't come from the common law, it doesn't come from the Constitution, it comes from our pre-existent sovereignty, which we bring into Section 35.
I think one of the key things that you hit home is we've always had them, and we're utilizing the system to make sure they're recognized. And then that way we have it reaffirmed that these are our pre-existing sovereign rights as well. And just kind of thinking about our time and the importance of hope, I'd like us to kind of end on a hopeful question. What does the future of our work look like? We have this inherent right to self-government recognized. People want to move there. Well, what does the future of our work look like now?
As I mentioned earlier, the babies being born today are the 8th generation under the Indian Act. So if we look at this notion of 7 generations, where we're not going to do something now that's going to impact and affect our children down the road 7 generations. We're in a position to make this the first generation that can do that in a long, long time. So that's the first thing. And I think the second thing is the realization that it may take us several generations to accomplish this. And that's why the notion, the reality, I should say, the factual reality of the recognition of our inherent right to self-government is so important. It's going to take a long time, but we'll always have that pre-existent sovereignty that we're bringing forward. And as long as it takes, it'll still be there. So the way I look at it, I've been doing this for a long time, since we came out of the Supreme Court of Canada, December 11th, 1997. It's only been in the last 4 years or so that we're starting to get traction on the ground. So there's a lot of education that's necessary here. And we've got to create enough critical mass to make that happen right across the country amongst all of our people. And that's the work that we've got to be doing now. And in those places where nations are ready to move, then we start making the move. And in the process, we're all learning, because we haven't done this before. So it's a learning process. And that's why through the Center for First Nations Governance, our approach is, and with the Rebuilding First Nations Governance research project, that when one nation learns something, that what that one nation learns is then transferable to all the other nations that we work with. So they empower and help each others. And so it's underway now, it's began. And there's no stopping it. It's gonna just get bigger and bigger and better and stronger and stronger. And someday down the road, we'll realize it right across this country. And where our people will effectively be exercising self-determination and self-government, and implementing our inherent right to self-government, so that we can have not only that nation to nation to nation relationship, but that we are in a position to look after the health and well-being of our people once again, and to take care of and fulfill our obligations as far as our sacred homelands are concerned. We have to look after the land, we have to look after all of our relatives that are there. And we need to teach Canadians why that's important. And what's really important here, because everybody's concerned about the land and the environment and what we're doing there, is that it's Indigenous people who have the jurisdiction to make the necessary changes. So if you look at it like that, and we put in place our own law regarding water, for example, then Canada and the provinces have got to enter into those negotiations with us to reconcile the law. So that means, and the court has said it, they've given the guidance, that it may mean that Canada has to amend or change their legislation, amend or change their regulations, amend or change their policies in order to have that reconciliation. So when you look at it like that, it's in the best interest of all of us. And that's the other element of reconciliation that's important here. The sovereignty is not held in the longhouse. It's not held in Parliament. It's not held in the legislature. It's held by the people. So, we're talking here about legal and constitutional reconciliation, nation to nation to nation. We need to also be talking about reconciliation on the ground between the people who hold pre-existing sovereignty as First Nations and the people who hold the assumed sovereignty of the Crown. So that reconciliation needs to take place as well. And I think that that's where people will start to see how this is in all of our best interest to do.
Thank you, Satsan, for helping us end this interview with a nice feeling of hope for the future. I'm feeling good. My language will say Kukshum Cow, thank you. And I'm going to say Kukshum Cow, Dr. Satsan. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for this. I appreciate this as well.
The fight for the inherent right to self-government has been a long one. Despite some of the bumps along the way and the lengths we still need to journey, there has been a real change in Indigenous rights acknowledgement in Canada and across the world. To help us understand the applications of these key concepts is Chris Robertson. Chris is from the Gitxsan Nation. As a Chief Operating Officer of the CFNG's predecessor organization, the National Center for First Nations Governance, Chris has worked with Satsan since time immemorial to push for self-governing rights of nations across Canada. Chris currently serves as an advisor at CFNG and sits on the RFNG steering committee. Like me, Chris is also a recovering band manager. Hey Chris, thanks for coming today. It's nice to see you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Mason.
First Nations have been fighting with Canada for a long time to achieve recognition of inherent rights. Tell me about that process.
So you got time for a month of podcasts? First Nations have been asserting their inherent rights really since the early days of colonization, the rights to land, self-government, and certainly cultural survival. For a lot of Canadian history, those rights were denied, ignored, and even outlawed. But as we know, through resistance, legal challenges, negotiations, certainly community leadership as well, First Nations have forced Canada to gradually recognize that those rights were never given up. And particularly in the case of treaties, recognition of land ownership and title and many other societal rights. The process over the many, many, many decades has been long, uneven, and often quite painful. But it's still ongoing, and in my feeling, the Indigenous people still continue to lead the way on putting up those rights.
So eloquently spoken and so quick. You did a month's worth of podcasts in just a few minutes. What had you hoped to achieve early on in your career?
Oh boy, I had to go back. I think really to be part of the movement of change. And reflecting back, it was really about resistance against a system that forced First Nations into the deplorable situations that they were in and pushing back at the government and their unjust laws. But then the law started to change rapidly, monumentally, and the government had to step back because the rulings First Nations went to court on were won, and one-handedly. Now it's more about bringing hope to First Nations that they have an influential voice and they can step out of the system that attempted to suffocate them. They can reorganize with full nationhood themselves without having to negotiate anything. They can pass their own laws and policies with no obstacles in the way other than their own people. And I say that because a lot of people are still stuck in that memory of resistance, distrust, and fear. My feeling is that we can be brave now and step out of the prisons that were built around Indigenous people. And we can knock those down and rebuild something that the people can connect to and be a part of.
I really like that quote you said, people are stuck in a memory of resistance and fear. And there's a term that I've come up with. I say, our people are stuck in this Indian Act paralysis. They're stuck in Indian Act thinking, and they're scared to move outside of that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a history of attempts to move out of it. We're actively restricted by the Crown, and with quite monumental penalties on the nations. And that's almost been genetically handed down. But it's shifting. And, I'm certainly delighted to see that a whole new generation is emerging that wants to see that change happen. They want to see movement take place among themselves.
You bring to mind the first episode of our podcast when we had Dr. Pousset and Dr. Abel on. They talked a bit about our history. Would you mind kind of sharing your take on, I guess, some of the things that left us stuck in this memory of resistance and fear?
I just sort of reflect back on my own experiences when I was working for a First Nation in Vancouver that were very active on the fishing rights file. And we went out to institute our own test fishery, knowing full well that the department was restricting our access to runs that we knew were starting to move up the Fraser River. And we sent out press releases. We made it very clear that we were going to head out with the flotilla. I just remember this surreal experience of coming around one of the bends in the lower mouth of the Fraser River and in my Zodiac, and I had a couple of reporters, a guy with a camera, to witness our flotilla from the community face this line of massive black Zodiacs from the Department of Fisheries, who proceeded forward and surrounded our flotilla of nets and started slashing away. And just the contrast to the two were astonishing. Here were people that had for tens of thousands of years been fishing this river, knew the biology, the movement patterns, facing off against this system from Ottawa that had come down in full force. And it really it was astonishing to see. It was shocking. These guys had their machetes out, ripping nets up to pieces, throwing fish back in the water. The First Nation, and it was the Musqueam First Nation, they were doing this as a test fishery for their food fishery. And it was just a complete shock and irony of the whole scene. It still plays out in my head today as an example. And of course, the Musqueam went on to win the Sparrow decision on fisheries, which was a monumental change in recognition of their fishing rights and the fishing rights of First Nations across the country.
I think what you're really bringing up that's resonating with me is we've got these two ideas of knowledge and practice, and we're looking at Indigenous knowledge and practice versus colonial knowledge and practice. And it feels like in the past, our Indigenous knowledge and practice weren't respected. But when we're moving forward, it feels like we're being more leaned on now, as we can see BC's wildfire challenges, where people are actually saying, hey, we could learn something about your traditional burning that you've done to kind of sustain your forests. Hey, we could learn something about how you guys have sustained your fisheries since time immemorial, really, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's imperative for First Nations to start, it's a rather Western concept, but to codify their knowledge and even exercise it in terms of creating their own law and policy around some of these practices that are quite foreign to the colonial system. Once we get serious about putting these things together, we can embed them in that place that we fought so hard for, Section 35 in the Constitution, which provides that umbrella of protection from the Crown on our systems of knowledge, for example.
I love that, Chris. And I'll jump to Section 35 in the Constitution very shortly. Canada does have constitutional duties to acknowledge Indigenous rights. For example, the Canadian government's duty to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples. Why is it important that these duties be recognized constitutionally and lawfully?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important that Canada's duty to Indigenous peoples, like the duty to consult and accommodate, are recognized constitutionally and lawfully, because it ensures they're not optional and they're not subject to political will. These duties flow from the Constitution, particularly Section 35, which affirms existing Indigenous rights by grounding them in law. Grounded in law in that, firstly, they're enforceable. So First Nations can hold governments, the Crown, accountable in court if these duties, like the duty to consult and accommodate, if they're ignored. I think as well is that they provide stability. The legal recognition creates clearer expectations for government, industry, and of course ourselves, when all parties understand what their responsibilities and obligations are. Reconciliation. Constitutional recognition respects Indigenous peoples as rights holders, not just stakeholders, and not just as third-party interests, but it reinforces that nation-to-nation relationship. So, in short, the legal and constitutional recognition turns those moral obligations into binding commitments.
That's very well said, and I think what you're talking about is very timely too with what's happening across the country. As you're aware, in this Trump era of the world, Canada, the federal government of Canada, and the province of BC are assenting some acts that are going to be, it feels like they're ignoring their duty to consult and accommodate to build these massive energy projects in the quote-unquote best interests of the Canadian public. What are your thoughts on this, Chris?
Yeah, I was rather amused when that legislation was being proposed and passed. The language they were using, all in the national interest. Sort of on the one hand, it was a very odd tacit recognition by flopping out it's in the national interest as though that trumps, pardon the use of that word, Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights and the duties of the Crown. And it can't. The duty to consult and accommodate is embedded as a duty, and that cannot be undone no matter what language or legislation you use. I think it's up to us to hold the Crown and industry's feet to the fire on that, and we don't let up. We keep reminding them constantly. And if they step out of line, then we just go back to court. Again, we know where the court will rule. And if anything, it may very likely give more clarity to what's in the national interest. And what's in the national interest is to uphold the duties and obligations under Section 35 of the Constitution. It's fairly obvious, but we, at the First Nation level, we have to be prepared. We have to be organized. We need to be putting in our own systems. We need to be putting in our own laws and policies. We need to be putting in our own approaches to consultation and accommodation. We need to be acting like governments, not administrative arms of the Department of Indian Affairs, in order to face this possible tsunami of development that it may very likely occur in our territories. I think the time is now. We have to get organized. I think doing so will send a very clear message to the Crown that we know we're ready, we're prepared, they must deal with us seriously.
I love that, Chris. I love it. I feel so empowered. I feel like let's go out there again, let's sing our Constitution song, and let's take our rightful place as a third order of government.
I like to think of it as another order of government.
Another order of government. I like that too. Ducharme, Satsan, and Chris for sharing your informed voices today. We hope you join us next time on Inherent Rights, Informed Voices, Reclaiming Our Rights and Ourselves. Next episode, we'll be discussing Indigenous rights and legal orders in Canada with our host, Julie Williams.